Hello, everyone. I'm Brian Jones, the Associate Director of Education at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and I am thrilled to greet you all and welcome you to this program, Unearthing Genius and Joy with Gholdy Muhammad and featuring Treva Lindsey. Thanks for joining us. And thanks also to Nicole Kochi for live captioning tonight's event for the hearing impaired. We will paste instructions for viewing those captions in the chat window now. The Schomburg Center, a world-renowned institution dedicated to archiving, studying, and interpreting the global Black experience, is celebrating its 95th year. And we have a lot of virtual and digital offerings in store, including a Black Liberation reading list, a Schomburg syllabus, and much, much more, all of which you can explore by visiting schomburgcenter.org. Today, we're gathering to talk about teaching. To say the very least, this is both a challenging school year and political moment. Whether your student's classroom is inside a school building or inside your home, we're going to talk about bringing Black genius and Black joy into the learning process. The Schomburg Center is uniquely positioned to help educators in that work, and today we're going to offer some resources that you can use and ideas about how to use them. To guide us in that effort, I'm so excited to be joined here today by educator and scholar Gholdy Muhammad, Associate Professor of Language and Literacy at Georgia State University, and author of Cultivating Genius, an equity framework for culturally and historically responsive literacy. Now, way back in the before times, audience members at an event like this would purchase Gholdy's book at the Schomburg shop and walk over to have Gholdy sign the book right after the event. But today, we're still going to ask you to purchase copies of Gholdy's book from the Schomburg shop. Just visit schomburgshop.com while supplies last. Virtual events are not the same as gathering in person, but they do create some new opportunities for engagement. So for example, when we get to the last portion of our program tonight, if you want to ask a question of our speakers, you can click on the Q&A menu item, which for most of you will be near the bottom of your Zoom window. Type your question into the box that pops up, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. This event is being recorded and will be available for anyone to view after the fact at the Schomburg Center's YouTube page. It's also streaming there live now. For those of you attending inside the webinar, you will remain anonymous in the recording. If we read out your question, we will only mention your first name to preserve your anonymity. Don't wait until the very end. Feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can in the last part of tonight's agenda. But first, we're going to hear from Gholdy Muhammad, who will talk about her framework. She'll show us some Schomburg resources, and then talk about those resources with Treva Lindsey, Associate Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at The Ohio State University. And then Gholdy will share some strategies for teaching with those resources. And then we'll take questions from you, the audience. So let's get to it. I'm thrilled and honored to bring on stage Gholdy Muhammad. Welcome, Gholdy.
Hi, Brian. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm so happy to be here. I just want to say thank you to you, Brian, for all the work that you do with education in the Schomburg. The Schomburg has always been so pivotal in cultivating my own genius and joy. So it's such a historic moment for me to be able to share my work and model and to look through you all's wonderful digital archive to think about how I can bring this past to the present in our schools today. So I will be talking about my model of culturally and historically responsive education. I will showcase different archives from the digital collection at the Schomburg. And I would hope that parents and educators and community members leave with me today with lots of resources, such as textual resources, lesson plans, unit plans, and importantly, knowledge. And like Brian mentioned, I will be in conversation with my sister genius, Dr. Treva Lindsey, and shortly we will be in conversation to talk together about one of the collections on Black women suffragists. And so following our conversation, I will show you some mini collections of curriculum. So let's talk first about this need to unearth. To unearth means to dig into historical archives, into the historical past to discover. To unearth means to discover something new, hidden, or lost, something that has been kept secret, intentionally or unintentionally. We must unearth our truths, the truths of our paths, our knowledge, our stories, our understandings, and uniquely for Black and African people, because the world has been diligent in keeping our stories hidden. And so, as my mother has always taught me, what has been hidden and buried beneath the earth's soil will always spring up toward the sun. And so we must unearth, excavate, and reveal the unspoken, uncovered, hidden, and deeply seated histories of our past, of people of color across the world, because our children deeply need and deserve a curriculum that is intended to capture their brilliance, their genius, their beauty, offering more complex and more complete views of themselves, and aren't just seeped in narratives and stories of pain, but also of joy. So I want to say again, welcome. We have always started with genius and joy. From the days of our sister Harriet Tubman, from using songs and spirituals and hymns, like the song Go Down Moses. And when you heard that song, it was an indication that if you desired freedom for yourself, you could have it. That was genius. From hair braiding into our Black girls and women's hair, sometimes hair braiding maps, and sometimes just hair braiding for joy and beauty. That is genius and joy. See, our stories always started with genius and joy, and they continue with genius and joy throughout the decades. From the brilliant rhetoric of my favorite essayist, Maria Stewart, to the unique ways that our sister Zora Neale Hurston used language, our language, so we can see ourselves in literary works, to her contemporary, Dr. Yolanda Seeley Ruiz, who wrote a book about love and told us to be brave enough to love ourselves and to love others. Happy birthday, Yolanda. Today is her birthday. To the genius and joyful stylings of jazz, of hip hop, genius, joy, of bounce music, genius, joy. And even in the most harshest of conditions, Black folks always strive to have joy. And that's something very beautiful. And as a historical researcher and scholar, I would find the language of genius and joy throughout the historical archives. And that was just so fascinating. You could say I can't hardly keep myself, because I was so fascinated by the history of it all. Like this Schomburg archive of a book published in 1863 entitled The Black Man and His Genius. See, we've always knew our genius. We've always written and documented our genius. Now, unearthing is important in education because there is an erasure of Black genius and joy, not only in K-12 schools, but in teacher education as well. See, we learn about the educational theorists of Vygotsky, John Dewey, Maslow, Piaget, but we teach less about those who actually have experience and a historical record of successfully teaching Black and brown children. People like Mary McLeod Bethune, who opened a school for Black girls in Florida. Anna Julia Cooper, who taught us intersectionality and who was a school principal and a teacher. Sister Treva Muhammad, who taught us one of the first models for homeschooling and educating our own. Others like Carter G. Woodson and W.B. Du Bois, Elizabeth Thorne Scott Flood, who opened up her home in 1854 to Indigenous and Asian American students, in addition to Black children. Frankie Harris Wassam, who was a school principal in Tennessee, And she taught for 54 years, both in K-12 education and historically Black colleges. See, these are the people we need to be learning from in our teacher education programs. And so I invite you, if you are a professor, a teacher educator, to go to the Schomburg and look at the digital archives and look at your syllabus and ask yourself, do I have this sister or brother on my course syllabus? Am I unearthing, right, Black genius to engage our future teachers of the United States? Because if we're not, we have more work to do. Now, because our education system is still following anything but Blackness as the model, this is the problem. This is one of the first textbooks for teaching children how to read in the 1600s. This was published in Boston in the United States. This was called the New England Primer. And when I study this book closely, I find so many problems, but here are 5 problems. The primer centered whiteness, white culture, white representation, white ideologies. It neglected to offer diversity of humanity, diversity of thought. The primer was apolitical. It did not have any opportunities to learn in a socially just way. The primer did not allow one to see wide identities and manifestations of themselves. And even though the primer was taught to Indigenous people, it only featured the English language and it only taught skills. Now, if you're teaching just skills, I have to tell you that is not genius and it's certainly not joy. When we compare this to today, 1600s to 2020, when we compare this history to where we are today, and we look at the Common Core state standards and other state curriculum standards, when we look at state assessments, when we look at adopted curriculums for school districts and schools, and we look at teacher evaluation, we are still only testing and evaluating and teaching skills. So in that way, not much has changed from the 1600s. These parts of our educational system today are still noticeably absent from the histories, identities, liberation of Black people. And so I'm arguing that it is time for a new way forward because Blackness always gave us the model. Why should we study Blackness? Because very plainly put, the learning standards or learning goals historically for Black people were more advanced than we have in schools today. Why not learn from a group of people who simultaneously found genius and joy in everything that they did amongst the nation's harshest realities? See, that's the group of people that we need to learn from. And in my own research, I study Black literary societies. I've been studying these archives and Black literary societies from the last 10 years, which started with young Black males in 1828. They read, they learned, they debated, they wrote. And they did so in ways where they were cultivating their mathematics, their science, their social studies. This image is also from the Schomburg Center. And they did so as they were cultivating their genius and joy. They did it in a way of what Bettina calls these abolitionist pursuits towards justice and humanity and a better way forward. See, they weren't just cultivating their minds, they were doing so to put it into action, to make the world a better place. And so in one literary society member, James Fortin, who was a leading thinker of the time, we can learn everything we need to learn about education just from this one artifact that he wrote. He gave this speech in 1837 to the American Moral Reform Society. He says that I conceive that our literary institutions should have the power of doing. He says that our main objective is to accomplish 2 things, an intellectual reformation and a moral one. He says, I don't know but better ways to do this than by reading, by close comparisons, by thorough investigations. Because if you can become into a thinking space, you would soon discover that your highest enjoyment consists of improving your mind. He says this will give him rich ideas and teach him that your limbs were never made to wear chains of servitude. You would see that equal rights were intended to all. And then he says, now the way I'm describing education, who would not want to be inspired with the taste of reading? Now let's break this down. What do we learn from him? We learn a few things. We learn that by education is linked to skill development, but not just skill development. We have to do something with those skills. Education is linked to action. Historically, for Black people, this has always been the case. We learned from Blackness that education was about cultivating our minds and our hearts. We learned that you did not have education without teaching about anti-racism and justice. We learned that we wanted to cultivate our knowledge in a way to be able to debate and stand in the same room with anyone. Intellectualism. And finally, just from his very few words, we learned that education is linked to joy. Do you know that there are some kids in our K-12 classrooms who leave our high schools who have never experienced joy? Now, I don't know about you, but I want to be on one side and not the other. Because when you break this down, we were more advanced historically among Black folks than we are in the United States in education today. And so I studied this model. I came to these 5 different learning goals that we had historically. See, today we only have one, which is skills. But historically, we cultivated our identity. It was important for us to know who we were, to celebrate, to validate our identities, our multiple identities. But we also spent time learning about the cultural lives of people who are different than us. We learned skills and proficiencies across the different content areas. We learned new knowledge, intellectualism. Our 4th goal was criticality. See, we were focused on understanding equity, power, and anti-oppression. That's criticality. And finally, we had the pursuit of joy. Now, joy is so important and so beautiful because, you know, we didn't neglect it, even in the time of pain and harshest realities. And to exemplify this point, I want to show you this 1837 archive, this artifact. It says, by reading, you can visit countries that you have never been to. You can converse with the wise. You can view elegance when you read and when you learn. You can ascend. See, literacy and education was linked to ascension. That's a beautiful thing. And by reading, you can enkindle the most sublime emotions that can animate your human soul. And every time I read that, I get goosebumps because I'm like, that's what I want. That's the kind of curriculum I want to write. And they did not call their learning standards. See, let me just be clear. Learning standard is a word that did not come from Black people. Standard is a word that is seeped in smallness. Standard indicates a ceiling, a stopping point. I am learning the standard to pass a test. What Black people called our learning goals in schools and education and communities were pursuits. See, pursuits indicates that I am learning this toward the goals of self-determination, self-reliance, self-empowerment. I'm not learning this to just pass a test. A pursuit is something that is more connected to one's life. And in the spirit of pursuits, this is just the intro, you all. We are going to move into what can this look like in practice by taking the Schomburg's, just some examples of some digital collections. Those of you who know me, or if you know my work, I love curriculum writing. I engage in curriculum writing. And so when this idea came up, I said, oh, we got to do something with this because it's genius and we have to bring this genius of the past to the present. And what better way to do this than to be in conversation with a genius, right? And so I want to introduce my scholar, sister, and friend and historian, Dr. Treva Lindsey. Together, we're going to talk about unearthing a part of historical genius of Black women suffragists. And this is really timely as we just listened to another debate last night featuring a Black woman, right? And following the conversation, we're going to see what this looks like in practice. Now, Dr. Treva Lindsey is so many things like Black women are, but she is also an associate professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at the Ohio State University. Her research and teaching involves so many fascinating and intersecting parts of Black women's history, such as Black popular culture, expressive culture, feminist studies, hip hop studies, and sexual politics. So I'm going to be in conversation and stop sharing my screen for, I guess I can keep it up. Hi, Treva, how are you?
Hi, Gholdy. I was just enjoying listening to you speak about this and this work. I'm a fan always. So thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you to the Schomburg for having me be in conversation with my sister genius. I'm so deeply appreciative of this opportunity.
Oh, of course. And sadly, we should not have to do so much work to unearth the genius, right?
Yeah.
And we know that there's so many parts of history that we still need to learn, that our students need to learn. And we're going to talk about Black women in the suffrage movement. And while folks know about the suffrage movement, they typically know about like Susan B. Anthony, but they know less about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, right?
Yes.
And so as I've sort of studied and taught a little bit about the suffrage movement with Black women, it came to me that Black women are always creating through social change from then to now. So can you first talk about the suffrage movement and the significance of Black women and our involvement, and why do we need to unearth this part of our history?
Absolutely. So this year you might have seen or experienced or been a part of some kind of centennial celebration for the 19th Amendment, which essentially prohibits discrimination regarding gender or sex at the time with regards to the right to the ballot, the right to the franchise, the elected franchise. And you probably heard some of the familiar names, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Maybe you heard Alice Paul. And thankfully this year, a lot of Black women were like, what you not gonna do is, and really gave us an opportunity to think about all of the contributions that Black women made and led with regards to the suffrage movement. I think it's first important to understand the suffrage movement and suffrage activism in the United States is a much longer history than Seneca Falls to 1920. That really truncates it and again centers white women and centers the activism of white women. It's important to think about what these women learn from the Iroquois Federation with regards to egalitarian rights and using that as a model to think about women's rights in a different context. It's important to understand the role of abolition and abolitionist thinking in the development of what became the suffrage movement, which of course is informed by Black women and Black men and are integral, right? The Slavery Convention of 1837 is as important in the history of thinking about suffrage activism as is Seneca Falls. And then, of course, you get to 1920, and guess who still really couldn't access the ballot? That would be us. That would be Black women. That would be women of color more broadly. And we continue that fight, although white women, by and large, exited the voting rights movement after 1920, and we continue to push for that up and through 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which is celebrating the 55th year this year, although it's been severely gutted in the last decade. And if you think about now, like an organization like Black Votes Matter and LaTosha Brown's work and the work that's happening there, this continual stream of Black women being at the forefront, or what Martha Jones calls the vanguard of the kind of activism that's happening. So at no point in the history of mobilizing around suffrage do you not have Black women and the unique ways that Black women organize around rights. and a fundamental understanding of a democracy that's never existed in the United States.
You see, I got my pen in my hand. I was taking notes because I'm like, oh, I need to learn about that. I need to teach about that. Why would you say we have been so erased, from this history?
It's easy to erase when the basis of the ways that we learned is fundamentally anti-Black, anti-woman, anti-queer, ableist. It is an endeavor, as you mentioned earlier here, of this kind of set of skills and objectives and standards versus a pursuit. If one were to pursue in the archives, it would be impossible to erase Black women from the story of suffrage activism. It would be impossible to do that because we're right there. We're at the marches, we're at the parades, we're in our newspapers, we're in the printed ephemera of the late 19th and early 20th century. We are attending conventions, even though we are risking in many ways our lives and our livelihoods by being present in these moments in these places that intentionally exclude Black women from being there, both on the basis of racial identification as well as gender identification. And so the archive often, and the ways that we approach the archive, the ways we approach, as you said, unearthing, tends to reflect the kinds of the internalization and the externalization of racial, gender, and sexual oppression, as well as class oppression, when it comes to figuring out which historical figures mattered, right? The figuration now that we say like Black lives matter, well, in that lives in there, it's the things that we do, the material realities, the terrains that we've charted. And we understand that the ways that we've been educated in many ways reproduce the same kinds of oppressive tactics and forms that tell us that we were unimportant in these moments, that we were insignificant to this historical moments, that because our activism looked different or because we mobilized in these kinds of communities, that wasn't as significant as those who rallied in front of the White House. But notably, those who rally in front of the White House had a certain kind of public space and identity and a position within the framework of American citizenship to be there that wasn't policed in the same way that a Black woman protesting in that way would have been, where she's now open to a particular kind of fatal violence if she endeavors in the public in a different kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about too, as you're talking, all the barriers that were put in place, like the literacy voting test, the literacy test for voting. And then when we compare that to the state assessment, which carries a lot of cultural and historic bias to it. And then we wonder why our students, namely our Black and brown students, don't perform on those tests because of the same bias and problems that existed in like the literacy tests. I mean, these barriers are still put up.
Absolutely. I mean, that is the fundamental project. Whenever you want to ask if something is moving towards a more democratic practice, the question to ask is what barriers are extant? What barriers are still in place? And then to ask ourselves why those barriers remain in place. So when we look at literacy tests that were happening at this juncture, and even now in thinking about how people can and cannot access the ballot, it's still based in particular questions of access and who is seen as valuable. And it would be interesting for a lot of folks to know that their favorite white suffragists, some of them even argue for educated suffrage. And educated had a very particular meaning in the late 19th and early 20th century that was saying that only a certain kind of person deserved the right to exercise their citizenship in such a way. And I think when we see that trajectory moving forward with all of these other barriers and tests and mechanisms by which we can separate out, discipline, police, and surveil in ways that protect this idea of this is where knowledge is produced and this is the only knowledge that we value. And if you fail the assessment that says you're worthy of that knowledge, then suddenly you are less worthy, less valuable. Yes, and I think that's such an important trajectory of seeing all of these kinds of testing and vehicles for saying you belong here, you were tracked in this way, that absolutely replicate things we saw in the Jim Crow era, that things we saw in the mid-20th century as things were shifting legally. But it doesn't just have to change legally. This is a cultural phenomenon. This is a social phenomenon. And this has deep roots in the politics and the very fabric of this nation's practices of exclusionary politics.
Yeah. No, I mean, it just reminds us that our schools has always been reflections of what we've seen in society, including all of the oppression, right?
Yes.
So what do you think we can take, as we just witnessed Kamala Harris and the vice presidential debate, what are the understandings from Black women activists and suffragists? What can they teach us about anti-racism, voting, and the pursuit for justice today?
Ooh, I mean, I'm always learning from my ancestors, right? And thinking about the work that they did and their work continues to do. I think it's interesting when we frame it as though there were set accomplishments and achievements that were made by these women, as opposed to these long lasting effects of the kind of work that they did. So I think one of the key things I always take away is that they build in community, right? They are very much so grounded in knowledge systems and knowledge spaces and knowledge cultivation that's happening in spaces that are not anchored in the exclusionary politics of our educational system, our political system, the various systems in this nation. I think what they did was say, we're being excluded even in a movement that in many ways we're powering and doing, but that's not going to make us give up on understanding what a fundamental right looks like and how we demand that right. So whereas we might see a kind of white liberal feminist construction of, and she persisted, I think what we see in the practice of Black women suffragists and Black women activists throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, and certainly before and moving forward, is a true commitment to a project of democracy that's never actually been America's project. There's something to be said for the ways that Black women get burdened with the idea of like, we will save the nation, we will do this, we will do that, listen to Black women, trust Black women, protect Black women. You'll have every kind of hashtag indicating some kind of faith, trust, or something in Black women, when all that we see tells us something very different.
Right.
That misogynoir is coined by Moya Bailey and So True tells us that there's a particular kind of hatred and fear of Black women, femmes, and girls that permeates all of these different systems. And so Black women are contending, Black femmes are contending with that in the ways that they mobilize by having intersectional critiques, by holding together these different categories, these different systems that they have to navigate as a racially oppressed group, a gender oppressed group, as oftentimes a class oppressed group, and move towards that. And what you've always seen in these spaces, that Black women who have moved from the margins to the center, to quote our great Black feminist Bell Hooks, is that what we see is that even those who are marginalized within those spaces, who are not as wealthy, who are disabled Black women, there's an incredible tradition of Black women who are disabled, like Harriet Tubman, like Fannie Lou Hamer, who are finding ways to move the needle on these conversations around justice that center the most marginalized. And I think that's the important thing we have to think about in our work, in our curriculum, and the ways that we approach this is, who is most deeply affected? Who is most vulnerable in these kinds of situations? And what do we need to do to speak to them, right? To be in conversation with them, to be fully engaged and invested with them.
And look, girl, you a bad sister. I know you get that a lot, and I'm going to say it again. You're reminding me too how much teachers should not rely on curriculum companies to give them the history. Like, listen to a historian, listen to a feminist, listen to a mathematician as you're developing curriculum. It does not always have to come from those spaces, right? Okay, so that's important. Now, in my last question, I want to ask you about joy. you know, as someone who also loves history, engages in archival research and studying historical documents, you know, I get so much joy from it. Like almost like I lose my whole world. Like time passes, I'm writing poetry back to brothers and sisters of the past because I'm falling in love with all of them from the 19th century. It gets really ridiculous with me. But and then as Brian knows, I got a little lost in the archives, you know, when preparing for today. But I want to ask you this: in your own journey, as you unearth Black historical genius, what have been some of your favorite moments of joy?
Hmm. You know, there's so many. That's what's funny. I mean, people would think because I'm looking at the Jim Crow era primarily and contemporarily, I'm looking at violence against Black women in the work that I do, that pleasure would be so far from what it is that I'm working with. But one of the collectives I belong to is the Pleasure Ninjas, founded by Joan Morgan, and that includes Brittany Cooper, Kyla Story, Yaba Blay, and Esther Arma, and our pursuit of finding that. And as a historian, I'm looking for the pleasure. And I think that's a practice that I seek pleasure, because so often Black women and femmes in a historical and even in a contemporary perspective are taken up as a battleground, right? That we take it up as like, what's the battle? What's the trauma? What's the injury? What's that? And that work is significant. Clearly, I'm writing a book about contemporary violence against Black women, so it's super important. But if you ask the archive, how did Black women play? How did Black women find joy?
Yeah.
How did Black women find ecstasy? And how did that affect the ways that they're navigating trauma, but also navigating the reality of a racist, capitalist, exploitative society? And some of it that's just fun because it's fun. And so my joy as a, like personally, I've been dancing all of my life. Dance is my first love, my first expressive language. Writing is probably like third or fourth for me, which is probably what I shouldn't say as an academic who writes books and articles and things. But finding dance in the archive, finding the Black women that I'm studying who are talking about sneaking out and dancing. If you read Brittany Cooper's book, Beyond Respectability, she talks a little bit about Mary Church Terrell going out at the gymnasium at Oberlin College, my alma mater, and with another Black woman who's there just to find time to dance. Right? Yes. To prove that she found that. So amidst this world that's telling her she needs to be respectable, she needs to perform in certain ways, she knew that was her joy and she sought it and she found ways to do that, right? There's all these women sneaking out in the woods to go do X, Y, and Z in these more rural contexts. There's someone like a Lucy Diggs Slow, who I write about in my first book, Color No More, who played tennis, right? She's actually the first Black woman to win a national championship in tennis. And like, you find these moments that these women were creating and cultivating these amazing lives that are rooted in pleasure, that are rooted in joy. And that is part of that project. One of the things my colleague, Dr. Cooper says, right, there is no justice without joy, right? There is no justice without that. And if justice is at the center of the project that we're looking at in education, in our research, in all of these different arenas, then joy is essential. And the genius of that to me is what's possible when people walk and move and feel and have this multi-sensory experience with the ways that joy impacts how they think about justice and being present in the world.
Mm-hmm. And it's just a reminder for us to seek joy as we are educators and leaders and parents, because this world can be heavy. So thank you. You gave us so many great gems. People are going to have to play back and listen again, which, you know, we should listen. That's a beautiful thing. So thank you, Dr. Treva. We're going to have a moment where we can engage together toward the end with some Q&A. I want to move into what this looks like in practice, in K-12 practice. And so one of the very first things that I ask of teachers is to ask themselves 5 questions as they are writing or refining curriculum, lesson plans, unit plans. How will my instruction, they're very simple questions, but how will my instruction help students to learn something about themselves or others who are different? in this unit plan. From point A to point B, they should be learning something about themselves. What skills and proficiencies am I teaching for my content? How will my instruction help students to become smarter about something and teach them new people, places, things, concepts, right? And then how will my instruction help students to understand equity, anti-racism, anti-sexism, any kind of anti-oppression? And finally, how will this learning amplify and enable joy? And to do this, I encourage teachers to layer text. When you're cold outside, it's like you layer to stay warm. When you have instruction and lesson plans, you want to take the anchor text, like the picture book Mandela. Don't just read Mandela, layer it with image and multimodality and sound and maps and video and performance. And whenever you teach something painful, like Dr. Lindsey told us, you have to balance it with joy. So if you're teaching about apartheid, show some Black South Africans enjoying life, because that was our life too. It wasn't just what was done to us. So this idea of layering text is really important. And what I did was layer digital archives with different texts, both for read alouds at home with parents and for lesson plans with teachers in schools. So let's look and see what this looks like. I want to start with our parents here. Let's say you wanted to read the picture book, which is written by Kwame Alexander, Undefeated. I put these lesson pursuits in I can statements for your child. Identity, I can learn about Black leaders of the past and the present. Skills, I can learn about cadence and repetition in language. Intellect, I can learn what it means to be undefeated. I can learn about Black soldiers who gave up their lives when the country did not value who they are, who they were. And joy, I can learn about the joy Black people sought in times of resistance. Now, I am now linking all my lesson plans to family and home engagements. So what can we do as a family unit? What exercise can we do to really amplify this learning up? So as a family, it's funny that Dr. Treva talked about dance, because as a family, create an undefeated song playlist and dance together. And I layered the text with a power to the people button, as well as a young group of war women playing cards, Black women at the card table. I'm like, that felt like joy to me. And that picture came between 1942 and 1943. Here's another one with the picture book, I Am Enough. I can say what I am here to be. In the book, the character says, I am here to do this, I am here to do that. So we want our children to have that same thing. I can tell parts of the story. I can tell what it means to be enough. I will know my self-worth for criticality. That self-worth is important because that's that internal power. I can name the things I love about myself. And for the home and family connection, as a family, we're going to write a list of people that's in our village of support. Now, I paired this with a 1935 poetry book for Black children that I found on the Schomburg's archive, because it was such a beautiful image of being enough. This is another image. I saw this picture book and I went to the Schomburg's collection of buttons and I saw the Black is Beautiful button. And so I'm looking at this book, which talks about different shades of Black. I can learn about the beauty of Blackness. I can learn about metaphor and comparison. See, that's a skill. Intellect, I can define what beauty is and who gets to define it. For criticality, I can learn about colorism and have joy in the skin that I'm in. And as a family, you can look through old photographs and look at different shades being represented in those photographs. And to our last parent example, just so you can understand the model before we get to our women's suffrage soon. This comes from Timbaland, Nighttime Symphony. This is a book about beautiful sounds of the world. I can name those sounds that give me peace. I can comprehend what I read. I can learn what a symphony is. I can learn why we need sounds of peace in the world. And what sounds make me smile? And as a family, you can create a song together. I paired this with some very beautiful and powerful images of Duke Ellington and his orchestra, and Cab Calloway and his orchestra with the chorus girls in the backgrounds from the Schomburg Center. Now let's move to the classroom. I want to show you just a couple quick examples. Let's say for math, you're trying to teach students how to measure and calculate distance. I took one of the archives from the Schomburg on the Green Book and developed a unit plan where students get to think about themselves as travelers. They learn the history of the Green Book, not just what we learned in the movie, but the authentic and full history. They learn how African Americans experience racial violence, and they get to decide for joy what city they want to travel to. As a family, you could take a road trip. You can think about where you've been, where you want to go, and if we still need a road trip today. See, if you picture this unit plan with just worksheets in the math book, you have such an absence of genius and you have such an absence of joy. Let's look at, now one of the inspirations for this unit was the Carmen opera, which you see the blueprint there, which was around 1932. And Martin Luther King's speech to youth, "What is your life's blueprint?" where he asked young people to think about what are your goals in life. And so I used this to sort of inspire a unit plan where students learn about blueprints, the history of blueprints, why they are blue. They learn about those sociological and economic factors that can keep one down from reaching their life's goals. For math, they learn how to measure blueprints and scale drawings, writing personal narratives in ELA, how blueprints are connected to our blueprint of our DNA. And then for social studies, they can think about the blueprints of the United States, of people, places, and environments. And as a family, you can measure a room in your house or design a room. See, this begins to, again, move toward genius. Now, I want to show you one more example that really, the inspiration for this was from a photograph I saw on the Schomburg's digital collection from the Tuskegee Institute in 1902. It was students in a chemistry class. And so I thought about the periodic table, different culturally relevant items we use that have different compounds, elements, and matters in it. Students learn about our rare earths compounds. They might write an argumentative essay in ELA. They may learn about the compounds found in Africa. The criticality of this, though, is considering the cost, the value, the accessibility, how some of our Earth's rarest resources have been stolen, taken, right? As a family unit, they can think about which items they use every day as a family, because each element on the periodic table connects to something we engage with regular in our everyday life and how those items give them joy. Now, if you have time, I really want you just to go. I could not stop. I'm like, oh, I want to write a lesson plan about this. I want to write a lesson plan about this. It was something about the evolution of ink pens. And I'm like, I can do a whole unit plan on that. There were images of young Black children splashing in the water at the YMCA, of Catherine Dunham dancing, and Black families writing home. I just fell in love again with all of our genius of our history. And when we specify, because today Black women deserve our specificity, when we specify Black women in the archives there were so many beautiful images and different manifestations and representations of Black women, writers, readers, and thinkers of the past. Dancers, athletes, the woman in the suspenders, I'm like, she got my style, right? And so if we focus on Black women, there was one archive that I want to point out. It was called Notable Negro Women. And it really helped me to unearth different women that I had yet to learn about throughout our time. And so all of this became an inspiration for a little mini collection on Black women and Black women's suffrage. Starting from looking at Black women as readers, writers, and thinkers and doers of the word. See, we didn't just read and write, we did something. We did something with our activism. And so this comes from an 1890 artifact of women, Black women, sitting around a table with books. We also have an 1894 illustration of Phyllis Wheatley with the pen in her hand. So in the spirit, I said, well, what would I want to teach our youth about Black women writers from all of these beautiful and wonderful documented parts of history from the Schomburg? And so I took all of these understandings, and it was hard not to focus on one Black woman. And I created this unit plan where students will learn about Black women writers of different eras and compare their styles of writing to their own. See, young people need to know who they are as writers. They will study deeply study the style, the structures, the rhetoric, the cadence of Black women writers throughout time. They would learn why Black women have written. See, Black women have written for purposes to define self, to resist what's wrong in the world, and for social change. See, we don't write to describe, inform, and entertain like folks teach us in school. And for joy, Black women will study the joyful metaphors Black women, students will study the joyful metaphors Black women have written about. See, we have used metaphors in hair, in flowers, in water, and this becomes a curriculum for our students in schools today. So that's the first unit in the mini collection. Then I moved to being inspired by all these buttons, Brian. I mean, it was too many of them. I just wanted to wear them on my jean jacket. The button collection is a really cool part of the digital archives. And so I was particularly inspired by those women who were activists toward voting rights. And so this became like a new unit plan to teach students that they have a voice in influencing voting laws and political powers. They can learn how to gather information to write newspaper articles for skills. They can learn about how so many barriers, like Dr. Treva talked about, became mechanisms to defer and deter Black folks from voting, including the literacy tests for voting in the 1850s onwards. They will learn ethics of voting, and you can even layer like a Stacey Abrams speech with this easily. And students will learn how your own voice can help others and give other people joy. And when we think about the women's suffrage movement, particularly with Black women, this picture of the archive really stood out to me. And it sort of started this whole idea. And it read, Black women suffragists holding a sign reading "Headquarters for Colored Women Voters in Georgia." Now, I'm a Black woman now voting in Georgia, and I had to just stare and capture the beauty and the essence of this photograph. Our face, our prominence, our seriousness, our urgency. I mean, it's so much. You can just read this image to capture so much. And our collectivism, most importantly, stood out to me. So I use this again to inspire, how can we teach this in our K-12 classrooms? Because as Dr. Treva said, we don't learn about Black women suffragists. We learn about, typically in schools, like this was just a white woman's movement, a white woman's activism. And these are just 6 of many Black women suffragists who use their pens, their minds, their activism to make our society better. And so this became a unit. Students will learn about Black suffragists of the past, compare their own lives to them. If you want to link it to mathematics, you can quantify the number of voters that were impacted by the Black women suffragists of the time, compared to how much does Black women, as Treva said, how do Black women impact the vote today? That's all mathematics. You can have students read and write and do some research upon one of the women. You can read across different sources, both sources that erased us, primary source documents, and those that held our stories up. For criticality, you can learn about activism and anti-racist and the neglect of centering Black womanhood for criticality. And the joy goal I love is about collectivism and community. One thing that has always been joy giving for Black women is having community with one another. And the last example I'll show here is taking from our sister, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and teaching, unearthing her. She doesn't have to be this so-called hidden figure, right? She was so prominent in helping us to think about our roots and our progress and our joy and our genius. And so you can teach students about her life as a poet, a leading thinker, a public speaker, activist. She was so many things, like many Black women are. You can teach them about the concept of womanism and Black feminism, because she was at the center of that. And for joy, you can read to the students her poem entitled Only a Word, and think about, how does she find joy in this? She wrote, "Till our world so sad and weary finds the palmy rest of peace, peace to silence all her discords, peace till war, crime shall cease, peace to fall like gentle showers, or on parched flowers dew, till our hearts proclaim with gladness, lo, he maketh all things anew." That's a beautiful poem. If you're layering texts to teach the unit plan on Frances Harper, you can bring in readings from Foster's Frances Ellen Watkins Harper Reader. You can bring images, and you can even pair it with the performance art from YouTube. I saw it was a performance that embodied her work and her life. And you can even pair it or layer it with some contemporary texts like Jacqueline Woodson's Brown Girl Dreaming, or the picture book, Just Like Me. So, as we sort of wrap up and prepare for you all's questions, I just want to show you a couple things. One, when you teach with this genius model, with the joy model, you'll find that it's more advanced than what schools are currently asking for. And it's designed for all students. What students don't need identity, skills, intellect, criticality, and joy? What students don't deserve those 5 things? This was all rooted in Black historical excellence. And it restores the genius and the joy for not just our students, but our teachers too. And if you notice through all those examples I showed you, it doesn't teach skills in isolation. It is more contextualized. So as the teachers who are listening in, as you are you writing lesson plans or refining lesson plans, these are just some very practical questions you can ask yourself, starting with, of all the things in the world, why am I teaching this? And it cannot be because the school district told you to. That's not genius. That's a basic answer. And we're not a basic people. You need to be excellent in your response. You need to defend your pedagogy and know the true purpose of it. Ask yourself, how are you making it impossible for students to fail? How will you change as a result of this type of learning? What family and home connections can you make, and how will you spread and amplify joy? Because if you don't have that inner joy, it is not going to be transferred to your students. And I don't want you to wait We are who we have been waiting for. In the spirit of our sister June Jordan, we don't have to wait for schools to give us texts and textbooks. We don't need curriculum companies to tell us when, where, and how to teach. We have our own collections through the Schomburg, through other spaces where we can find those texts, those teachable texts. We can create curriculum in which that our students need for us that will unearth our genius. And we don't have to rely on other people or wait for other people to tell us our genius. We have it already here. So I'm going to end here for questions. And you see, Brian, at this point, I just said all the other archives I'm just going to throw on one slide because they were just all so wonderful. So I want to say thank you. And I'm going to turn it back over to Brian.
Thank you so much, Gholdy and Treva. That was so fun and joyful. And there's some more joy coming here. So actually, I just want to say, I know that I could tell from some of the questions that some people were just like you, where they had their pen out and they're writing things down. So I just want to let people know a couple of things before we get started. One is that the framework, digging more into the framework that Gholdy just described, is really all in her book. So you can go to schomburgshop.com right now and get her book. And that will help some people get started. But in terms of the lesson plans and the ideas that you were just putting together using Schomburg resources, Gholdy promised me that before we started that she would make those slides available so that I could send them out to everybody who registered for this event. So if you were looking for an image and couldn't get it down, we're going to push that out to you by email. So look for that soon. But that being said, we do have some questions of people trying to follow up and understand more. And the first one is really for both of you about, can you talk about some go-to resources for background knowledge? Make sure I've got this right. This is a question from Tova. Can Gholdy and Treva recommend resources and books that highlight Black women suffragists? And I assume this means primary and secondary sources to get to know the stories.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mentioned it a little earlier, but Vanguard by Martha Jones, which was just released this year, a fantastic book that's really tracing Black women's activism across different movements, but certainly suffrage is a central component of that. The late, great Rosalind Terborch's Penn's book about Black women and suffrage activism is a fantastic one. I always encourage, if you can, to dig and find Mary Church Terrell's masterful autobiography and look at her work, looking at the writings of Ida B. Wells. Again, Frances Harper was mentioned here early. We can certainly provide a list of, and I can add these into the chat while we're speaking, of a few women who, even if you just do a basic Google, and this is what I love about this moment of finding out who these women are, sometimes you just need to know their names to kind of dig in and see some of their words and hear their voices and feel their voices and impact. But I think both Vanguard, Rosalind Terborch Penn's book are really great starting places for engaging in the conversation around Black women's suffrage. I also did a recent guide for the League of Women Voters, Ohio, which is like a publicly accessible guide available online about the history of women's suffrage with women of color at the center of the narrative. And so that's just available on the League of Women Voters Ohio website for anyone. It has a reading list. It has things for children, everyone from children up to more kind of, academic text, and then wonderful young adult books and things that really get us at the question of what does it look like if we center suffrage activism on women of color and center how we think about that on women of color and the unique and dynamic strategies that they used.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a beautiful list. And Treva Lindsey's work. I hope it pushes publishing companies to write more picture books and young adult books. Because we have the writers out there, they just don't get published. The Black women don't get published in that way. And so, but you're right. You can start by looking at a primary source document that you find through any library's archival system and just do a basic Google search and you will find video and images and more primary source documents. That's a beautiful starting place.
Yes. one young adult one I just forgot to mention, Yvette Dion, who was actually long listed for a National Book Award for her book, which is a young adult of the history of Black women and suffrage activism. So absolutely check that one out to make sure educators, things that you can use. And there's books out there for every level from K through postgraduate study with regards to Black women in suffrage now, because so many Black women are like, we're going to tell this story. You see Asian American scholars working on this. One of my favorite suffragists is Mabel Pinghua Lee, who is a Chinese American suffragist. And so they're just histories being unearthed now with regards to how we think about and talk about suffrage activism.
Wow, thank you. I see that there's some questions that are about implementation. Adriana asks, do you suggest focusing on thematic units for better facilitation of these pursuits? Geraldine asks, these units are great. How can we get access to these? Has there been any work on adding support for English language learners with these units?
So, I mean, folks can email me for more, and there are certainly lots of them in the book. You know, I have a U.S. Department of Education. I'm in my 3rd year of my grant studying this model. So we have been collecting lesson plans. Sometimes I've just been speaking to teachers and they'll send me their lessons or unit plans from all over the country. And so like the number is growing in exemplars and samples. You know, ideally, I want to write more curriculum because I don't feel like curriculum companies have written to teach about Black excellence as much as they could, or to use Black historical models like this one. And to the first question, is it more of a thematic unit or like a lesson plan? You know, it's not intended that you teach all of the 5 pursuits in one day or one sitting. It is more like across, right? And so I have taught a lesson called The History of Libraries to 4th graders. I mean, it was really fun, y'all. And they loved it. And I have the video of them like engaging with me. And I taught that across 2 class periods. But I've also taught some of these units across like a week. So it depends on, I would throw the question back out to you. What are your goals for education? You can make them more simple or you can make them more complex. And then that depends on how long you need in terms of time.
Yeah, there are some questions that have to do with people feeling like how do they do this in the face of the standards and the requirements of the district? Ivan, one of the biggest hurdles that schools face is the pressure teachers face when it comes to standardized exams, which ultimately become the guiding mindset, teach to the test. Another teacher writes about being fired for challenging the curriculum. One of our first questions from Melissa, I was working, I assume, with some educators where one shared that she was verbally attacked by parents for having students read about the Breonna Taylor case. So in general, it's like, what kind of guidance or advice do you give to people who feel trapped by the circumstance, by the pressures of the school systems they're working in?
Yeah, so first we have to keep in mind, if we study history, there are people, we got Black activists as an example, but we have people who are engaging in their own activism to preserve whiteness and to preserve hate. And some of those are our parents, and they are teaching hate and racism to their children. See, we don't talk enough about those parents. We always got something to say about Black parents or Latinx parents. And do we talk about the parents who are teaching the tradition of hate and racism to their children in classrooms? And then that kind of mess gets into our class. And now I have to constantly try to sell people's humanity. I mean, why do we have to sell the humanity of Breonna Taylor? Why do we have to convince someone else, another adult, that her life mattered and we have to teach about justice? So, you know, First of all, you need to have leadership to support you in your pursuit for justice. This is what I mean. You have to know how to defend your pedagogy intellectually. This is not in conflict, what I'm seeing with the learning standards. What I'm teaching is not in conflict. It's not social justice or skills only. I am showing you a way to teach the skills in a social justice context. That is still preparing them to pass any test, the standardized test and the test that they will have multiple times in their life. So we don't have to have an either or dilemma. Either I have to focus on justice or helping my students understand the skills. That's foolish thinking. And it's very basic. You know, we did not get into education to test prep. Nobody became a teacher for that. We didn't become professors for that. We got into the field that we're in to inspire, to nurture, to cultivate an understanding that will prepare you for life. So you got to talk to the parents like that. You have to talk to your school administrators like that. This is not a hierarchy thing. This is talking about people's life. And it certainly isn't a political agenda. This is a human one. And if you're against a human agenda, you need to convince me why I should just be teaching skills only. I'm not trying to convince you. That is not my role. And so I really hope that, you know, you are in spaces that nurture and you get with other people who are in, just like Black women did in the past. We got with other women like us, you know. So if I'm struggling, I'm going to call Treva, you know, you've been doing this longer, you know how to respond to this. What should I do, sis? Like, that's what we need to be doing. Get your village together, because it's more than a village. This is going to keep you and to sustain you.
Yeah, I love that response. And I think that's so important that you mentioned village and community. And this builds on what we're saying earlier. Black women organize in collectivity. And so when you are faced with these challenges, you're faced with a hostile administration, you're faced with this pushback from parents, not only are you armed with what I'm teaching are both the skills and the soul and the heart of what we need to be educating our students on, but that you have a village that's behind you, that got the work, that got the proof, that can make sure that you are not alone in that venture, because it often feels like you're alone when you're warring against these death-dealing and soul-crushing systems and institutional practices and policies. And so first coming into Village and being like, this is what I'm struggling with, so we can all be part of figuring out how we push back. What is the way that we can push back here? Black women were also strategists, some of the best to ever do it. Across time. And so finding strategy is never a solo or individualistic project. So don't let the logics of capitalism and individualism and neoliberalism within education be the model that you use to respond to a moment like that, a crisis like that, right?
Yes.
Lean into the creativity, lean into the collectivity, lean into community, right? In those moments. And always, but certainly in those moments to help bolster. So you're coming with the research, you're coming with what we know is proven networks, that you're tapped into networks like the Abolitionist Teachers Network, established by someone like Bettina Love. Like, tap into these things so that you are never alone in these battles. If you're going to the battlefield alone, you're actually not in the tradition of the freedom fighters of past generations, right? These are not solo missions. These are not individual histories. These are collective community histories and collective and community-based strength and power to transform the world.
Yes.
Yes. I am Stephanie. As a kindergarten teacher, I'm wondering the Black women that I should highlight while studying science, math, writing, reading, music, dance, poetry, and more importantly, during Women's History Month. So Stephanie wants it all. What's the full battery?
Stephanie got to do the work, okay? You know, I always tell teachers who know me, I'm not about to give you the strategies and all the answers. You got to cultivate that mind first, because without me, once this talk ends, what will you do? Right? You got to cultivate your mind and your heart, even if it is the Google search. That's the start. Even if it is, you know, I love the Schomburgs. I feel like I could be on a commercial for the Schomburg Digital Archives. But the search was so, I like a good search tool. Their search was so precise, the way they cataloged it. And so you can even search dancer, teacher, artist, scientist on the Schomburg site to get some. So I want to put that question out to you and say, what do you find first? And then I'll give you more.
Okay. We have another question that's about, where is it? Question about, I'm wondering how, this is from an anonymous attendee, I'm wondering how Gholdy and Treva see anti-racism in the context of our system of capitalism. Has the nature of capitalism itself worsened or complicated racism and oppression?
Ooh, that's a whole lecture right there, right? And then some in the books and all of that. So, in short, I would say racism and capitalism are intertwined systems of oppression. And if I'm looking at the work of people like a Cedric Robinson and thinking even more acutely about folks who are working around ending prisons and policing, so much of this is based on the idea of racial capitalism, right? And the ways that the very labor, the productive and reproductive labor of captive Africans and enslaved people is at the heart of capitalism. And so there's no real way to evaluate the perniciousness, longstanding, and afterlives, as Saidiya Hartman would say, of slavery without having a concrete understanding of the ways that capitalism operates. So we can't have a class analysis that isn't attuned to anti-Blackness, and it's impossible to think about anti-Blackness outside of the context of capitalism at both a national and a global level, right? Because unfortunately, anti-Blackness is a global phenomenon. It is not singular to the United States. And the ways that capitalism operationalizes that, the ways that capitalism is predicated upon a fundamental buy-in to anti-Blackness is so important to think about. And the ways that our institutions are built upon that too, which means, unfortunately, our primary educational systems in this context also replicate logics that stem from this kind of racial capitalist model. So that's why your skills and transmission of standards and knowledge are the guiding principles, as opposed to pursuits, as opposed to thinking about freedom as a place or as a goal or aim for education. How to be a citizen, and in the most complicated way, right? Not in this very narrow defining of citizenship, but actually a human citizen, a personhood citizenship that is afforded to everyone and engaged by everyone. And capitalism often forecloses that. Capitalism has an exclusionary politics as well. And so I think it's important to see how anti-Blackness and capitalism work with one another to create the conditions that Gholdy in her work is pushing so powerfully and dynamically against, by offering us something different, than offering us something that isn't rooted in a system of racial capitalism.
Yeah, I remember reading about this book called The Measuring Rod for textbook selection. It was like a book that some white racist people put together and said, this is going to be the gauge of what books get selected in K-12 schools. See, they gave like a playbook. If the Black person looks happy enslaved, pick that book. If they look like they're resisting or fighting, do not pick that book. See, this has been laid out, and it's all tied to capitalism. It's all tied to opportunities for some and not for others. And honestly, I'm tired of the despite of narratives. We know that Black folks and Black kiddos have achieved despite of, but how much would we achieve if we didn't have to fight so much in education? There are so many people profiting off of Black and brown failure because the system was designed that way. And then if you fail, I make money. I mean, there are millionaires in education who have constantly had their pockets like, filled without making any kind of significant impact on our system, not just for Black kids, but for all kids. The system is not supporting any of them, honestly. It is basic for all of them. And so we really do need to talk and teach about capitalism in our teacher education programs. How can we not? Because teachers need to understand as they are first year teachers and beginning off. See, they think that students fail or struggle because of it's you, the child, it's your parents. See, that's not the reason. It's capitalism. But if we're not teaching the historicalness of everything, the institutions, if we're not teaching all of the things that led us systemically to where we are today, we're going to keep like blaming children and their families. And it's just simply unethical and it's not right.
Thank you. We've had a lot of questions from teachers and people talking about the classroom, but here's one that's about kind of another level from Tanya. Do you have any number one top policy recommendations for education policymakers, i.e. school board members and or advocacy groups to unearth the genius and joy of our students and educators?
So I was just talking yesterday to members of the Senate about this, and I said, look, it is simple. We are making it.
I just want to clarify, you're speaking about the US Senate. I want our audience to know.
There were US Senate, there was a lot of Illinois senators, and it was US Senate members. And folks are always wanting solutions. And this is what we need. If we can make it really plain, we need to start to chip away and transform those parts of our systems that are just damaging. The first, if I can say, are the Common Core standards. They are incomplete, they are flawed, and they do not represent the histories, the literacies, and the liberation of Black children. Black children are the group that we struggle to get it right with the most in this country. Is it ethical to keep a set of learning standards that were not written to reflect the histories of Black children? Is that ethical? I would say it's not ethical. We should take the oath to do no harm, like medical practitioners. So we need standards for equity and excellence. We need new learning standards that reflect students' histories and their identities, and equity that reflects equity. I'm not talking about rigorous work. I'm talking about teaching students to understand power, equity, and oppression. And we have so much genius in this country that if we get the right people together, it would take us a week. Y'all know, people know me, I don't play. I do things like this. I'm ready. It can take us a month. Hell, even if we took a year, we can do that. The second thing we have to do is stop with these high stakes assessments. It's too much pressure. Their tests are biased. They are incomplete. They either need to be thrown out or rewritten. We could do that in the same amount of time as we write the standards. The third thing we need to write is better curriculum. This means holding publishing companies accountable. How do you write a social studies curriculum without the word race and racism in it? I've seen it. We need to hold them accountable because we are paying them as school districts. So we need to hold them accountable for writing better content for our students. Number 4, we need to change teacher evaluation. Now this for real, I can write in a day because I have rewritten teacher evaluations. A lot of times we use the Danielson model and other models in schools, in our nation's largest urban schools with Black and brown children, and they do not hold teachers, they do not evaluate teachers on their ability to build students' social political consciousness. It's time for a new way forward. So if we change those 4 things in our system, and if you have the genius at the table and you have funders who are willing to see a new way forward and to see achievement for all, I guarantee you we'll have different results. So that's the policy we need. Of course, other policy has sort of just been putting fresh coats of paint on these scaffolds and building structures that are falling apart. And it looks new. Race to the top, no child left behind, RTI. Those have not significantly shifted the trajectory in our US public school system, but they look shiny and nice and new, and they may do some help. They may help, but I am talking about transformative policy. That's what we need. I don't know if I answered the question, but I probably got her trapped up.
I think you did. I want to reiterate for those who didn't hear it, because I see we're getting some questions about this, that we're going to send out some information from Gholdy and resources that Gholdy and Treva have shared. We'll blast them out to everybody's emails who registered for this event. And we'll share slides and information that you can use in case there's anything here that you missed. And of course, you can get Gholdy Muhammad's book at the Schomburg shop, schomburgshop.com. I guess we're running close on time, and so I want to ask you for last words, but let me squeeze in a couple questions. One is, do you ever host genius teacher collectivist collaboration circles? This is from Stephanie, where teachers can come together to work together to cultivate genius in our craft. And another is from a Black school psychologist with predominantly Black students and a predominantly white staff. This is Monique. Has a lot of teachers. Monique is in the position of having a lot of teachers complain that students are not engaged, and is trying to figure out how to start a conversation with them about changing or modifying their lesson plans to be more culturally competent and be more engaging for their students.
Yeah, so we can create the Cultivating Genius Collaborative and Joy Collective. I love that title. Like, let's do it. We've always created something out of nothing. So we can create it. I have those sort of informally, and this is like another of a collective, like even being in conversation here with Brian and Treva. But let's create it. And part of developing the model that I showed was to increase engagement. As a teacher, as a middle school teacher, I used to be kind of bored by the curriculum that was given to me. And so now I still teach youth as well as college, but I like it to be invigorating. So part of that engagement piece is, engaging them in something that's connected to their lives, that you can relate to real life. See, our students don't see it. They don't see how learning this is helping their lives unless you make that connection. So I'll just say part of the model was to increase engagement, but not just for students, but for teachers, because we deserve to be engaged and to have fun in our career. I don't want teachers going home sad or depressed or like uneasy. I want them to have joy as well. So yes, that's what it was created for.
All right, well, I think we have time. This will be a good moment just to ask you both for final thoughts. Last, things you've been thinking about, but didn't get asked before we close it out. Treva, do you want to go first?
Sure. Wow, this has just been so fantastic. As someone who was raised by two teachers, and who took much joy in the art and science of teaching, and cared deeply about their students, that was the model of education that I grew up with in my home space of thinking about education in that way. That and Black women have such a long history of education being this liberatory tool and transformative tool. And I just encourage folks, as you said, to lean into that. Look those things up. Start with Google and go elsewhere, but start with Google and build into that. This work should be joyful. This work should, as much as there's pain in there, there's trauma, there's violence, there are all of these things. Please understand that the joy that sustained our ancestors is what we also should be tapping into the work that we do. And we do this work with that consideration of joy, with that adoption and embrace of joy. The work is so much better. The work is more radical. And by radical, I simply mean in the tradition of Ella Baker and Angela Davis of getting at the root of something. The root of this problem is anti-Blackness. The root of this problem is economic exploitation. Students that are encountering so many forces of oppression coming into our classrooms, and we don't want our classrooms to mimic that. We want our classrooms to be spaces where we're challenging that, where we're offering something else, when we're offering something transformative. And that is the legacy of Black women's activism, the ability to offer something else, to imagine something else, and to then build that.
Yeah, I mean, all of that. I mean, that's, you know, and genius doesn't have to be like a word that's just reserved for a few people. You know, who told us that we weren't genius, you know? And who told us that we don't deserve joy in this profession and that our children. So, you know, when your school is telling you just to do one, you tell them I'm going to do 5 because I deserve 5 and our students deserve 5. And we don't live in a society for just skills only, for just the one. We live in a society that all students need to understand who they are and other people and to navigate oppression, because we are trying to cultivate, and this is something you can tell your colleagues. My goal is to cultivate the child that does not leave us and they contribute to other people's hurt, harm, or pain. I don't care if they're in a relationship with a partner, with a friend, or as a neighbor. I also am not trying to contribute to the child that grows older and is silent on other people's hurt, harm, or pain. I am trying to contribute to the child that will feel that it is wrong and disrupt it. Do you agree with me, or do you want to cultivate the other two? I mean, it could be that simple, but we are talking about people's lives here, and we're talking about other people's children. I don't care how you might treat your own, but when somebody else places you into the care of their child, that's a serious thing. And that's how you advocate for yourself in teaching something different. We need something different. It is time for us to have a new way forward. You don't, as Treva said, you don't have to do it by yourself. That is so ahistorical, right? You can do this in a community of brothers and sisters who are here with you. And so I encourage us all to be the genius, to get the joy, and to be in community with each other, because we need each other more than ever.
Thank you so much. That's our time for this program. Thank you, Gholdy. Thank you, Treva. Thank you for sharing this genius and this joy and the Schomburg, and showing ways to use Schomburg resources in this work. I know that I'm leaving this inspired, excited, and ready to do more. Please do visit schomburgshop.com if you can. Special thanks to everybody who donated tonight through Eventbrite. Or if you didn't and you want to make a donation to the Schomburg Center's education department, to our work, please go do so at schomburgcenter.org/support education. Stay safe, everyone. Good night.
Night.
Night.